Chapter 12 Part B. My lady led the way back. Before he followed her, the sergeant relieved his mind on the subject of the gravel walks by a parting word to the gardener. "Get her ladyship to try grass," he said, with a sour look at the paths. "No gravel. No gravel." Why Superintendent Seagrave should have appeared to be several sizes smaller than life, on being presented to Sergeant Cuff, I can't undertake to explain. I can only state the fact. They retired together, and remained a very long time shut up from all mortal intrusion. When they came out, Mr. Superintendent was excited, and Mr. Sergeant was yawning. "The sergeant wishes to see Miss Verinder's sitting room," says Mr. Seagrave, addressing me with great pomp and eagerness. "The sergeant may have some questions to ask. Attend the sergeant, if you please." While I was being ordered about in this way, I looked at the great Cuff. The great Cuff, on his side, looked at Superintendent Seagrave in that quietly expecting way which I have already noticed. I can't affirm that he was on the watch for his brother officer's speedy appearance in the character of an ass, I can only say that I strongly suspected it. I led the way upstairs. The sergeant went softly all over the Indian cabinet and all round the boudoir, asking questions, occasionally only of Mr. Superintendent, and continually of me, the drift of which I believe to have been equally unintelligible to both of us. In due time, his course brought him to the door, and put him face to face with the decorative painting that you know of. He laid one lean inquiring finger on the small smear, just under the lock, which Superintendent Seagrave had already noticed, when he reproved the women servants for all crowding together into the room. "That's a pity," says Sergeant Cuff. "How did it happen?" He put the question to me. I answered that the women servants had crowded into the room on the previous morning, and that some of their petticoats had done the mischief. Superintendent Seagrave ordered them out, sir, I added, before they did any more harm. "Right," says Mr. Superintendent in his military way. "I ordered them out. The petticoats did it, Sergeant, the petticoats did it." "Did you notice which petticoat did it?" asked Sergeant Cuff, still addressing himself, not to his brother officer, but to me. "No, sir." He turned to Superintendent Seagrave upon that, and said, "You noticed, I suppose?" Mr. Superintendent looked a little taken aback, but he made the best of it. "I can't charge my memory, Sergeant," he said, "a mere trifle, a mere trifle." Sergeant Cuff looked at Mr. Seagrave, as he had looked at the gravel walks in the Rosary, and gave us, in his melancholy way, the first taste of his quality which we had had yet. "I made a private inquiry last week, Mr. Superintendent," he said. "At one end of the inquiry there was a murder, and at the other end there was a spot of ink on a tablecloth that nobody could account for. In all my experience along the dirtiest ways of this dirty little world, I have never met with such a thing as a trifle yet. Before we go a step further in this business we must see the petticoat that made the smear, and we must know for certain when that paint was wet." Mr. Superintendent, taking his set down rather sulkily, asked if he should summon the women. Sergeant Cuff, after considering a minute, sighed, and shook his head. "No," he said, "we'll take the matter of the paint first. It's a question of yes or no with the paint, which is short. It's a question of petticoats with the women, which is long. What o'clock was it when the servants were in this room yesterday morning?" 11 o'clock, eh? "Is there anybody in the house who knows whether that paint was wet or dry, at 11 yesterday morning?" "Her ladyship's nephew, Mr. Franklin Blake, knows," I said. "Is the gentleman in the house?" Mr. Franklin was as close at hand as could be, waiting for his first chance of being introduced to the great Cuff. In half a minute he was in the room, and was giving his evidence as follows. "That door, Sergeant," he said, "has been painted by Miss Verinder, under my inspection, with my help, and in a vehicle of my own composition. The vehicle dries whatever colors may be used with it, in 12 hours. "Do you remember when the smeared bit was done, sir?" asked the sergeant. "Perfectly," answered Mr. Franklin. "That was the last morsel of the door to be finished. We wanted to get it done on Wednesday last, and I myself completed it by 3 in the afternoon, or soon after. Today is Friday, said Sergeant Cuff, addressing himself to Superintendent Seagrave. Let us reckon back, sir. At 3 on the Wednesday afternoon, that bit of the painting was completed. The vehicle dried it in 12 hours, that is to say, dried it by 3 o'clock on Thursday morning. At 11 on Thursday morning you held your inquiry here. Take 3 from 11, and 8 remains. That paint had been 8 hours dry, Mr. Superintendent, when you supposed that the women servants' petticoats smeared it. First knockdown blow for Mr. Seagrave. If he had not suspected poor Penelope, I should have pitied him. Having settled the question of the paint, Sergeant Cuff, from that moment, gave his brother officer up as a bad job, and addressed himself to Mr. Franklin, as the more promising assistant of the two. It's quite on the cards, sir, he said, that you have put the clue into our hands. As the words passed his lips, the bedroom door opened, and Miss Rachel came out among us suddenly. She addressed herself to the sergeant, without appearing to notice, or to heed, that he was a perfect stranger to her. Did you say, she asked, pointing to Mr. Franklin, that he had put the clue into your hands? This is Miss Verinder, I whispered, behind the sergeant. That gentleman, miss, says the sergeant, with his steely gray eyes carefully studying my young lady's face, has possibly put the clue into our hands. She turned for one moment, and tried to look at Mr. Franklin. I say, tried, for she suddenly looked away again before their eyes met. There seemed to be some strange disturbance in her mind. She colored up, and then she turned pale again. With the paleness, there came a new look into her face, a look which it startled me to see. Having answered your question, miss, says the sergeant, I beg leave to make an inquiry in my turn. There is a smear on the painting of your door, here. Do you happen to know when it was done? Or who did it? Instead of making any reply, Miss Rachel went on with her questions, as if he had not spoken, or as if she had not heard him. Are you another police officer? She asked. I am Sergeant Cuff, miss, of the detective police. Do you think a young lady's advice worth having? I shall be glad to hear it, miss. Do your duty by yourself, and don't allow Mr. Franklin Blake to help you. She said those words so spitefully, so savagely, with such an extraordinary outbreak of ill will towards Mr. Franklin, in her voice and in her look, that, though I had known her from a baby, though I loved and honored her next to my lady herself, I was ashamed of Miss Rachel for the first time in my life.